Welcome to another amazing session, this time with Phyllis Cole-Dai. Phyllis began pecking away at an old manual typewriter in childhood and never stopped. She has authored or edited more than a dozen books in multiple genres, writing across what divides us. Originally from Ohio, she now resides with her scientist husband and two cats in a 130-year-old house in Brookings, South Dakota. Phyllis is going to speak to us on the power of poetry to help us thrive. Welcome, Phyllis, and help our listeners understand the power of poetry and tell us more about what you do that might help them thrive.
Well, thank you, Myrtle, and thank you to you, the listener, who are tuning in here. And I bet you thought you were never going to sit through a session on the power of poetry, but here we are, and I'm delighted to be here. And Myrtle, congratulations on putting together this great event. It's a privilege to be a part of it. As Myrtle told you, I'm a poet and an author. I also dabble in music. I'm a public speaker, and I have an online community called The Raft, where we buoy each other up by using the arts and spiritual practices as we go through our daily lives. And I have been committed for a very long time to using the arts, and particularly literature and music, to inspire people to bridge the divides within us and between us, and to live from our true spots. I think of our true spot as an inner place of profound gratitude and compassion, courage, and connection. And, you know, sometimes when we experience someone from our true spot, when they say something, or they play a piece of music, or they write us a passage in a letter or something that hits our true spot, we feel this little maybe jolt of electricity go through, or a butterfly in our stomach, or, you know, there are different ways that our body gives us signals that our true spot has been kind of smitten. And the same way when we express ourselves, you know, from our true spot, there are different signals that we feel in our bodies and minds to let us know that we're expressing ourselves from an authentic place. And I treasure those kinds of exchanges that I have in this world. And I think everybody is capable of living from their true spot. And that's what my work is to try to inspire that kind of living. Myrtle asked how I kind of got started at this, and I got to tell you, I don't really know. You know, obviously I had very supportive parents and mentors and lots of opportunities to stretch myself beyond my comfort zone as I've gone through my life. I am grateful for all of that, and I feel very privileged. But there's another part of it that just seems like it was always there, like it was born in me. I remember when I was in second grade that one of my school teachers had given me an assignment to write a poem, yes, in second grade. And I told her that I wanted to be a poet and a writer when I grew up. So even at that age, I had this dream, and I've done lots of other things along the way, but my desire to harness the power of language has been a constant in my life, in part, I think, because I have seen the power of language and the effects that it has on those around me. And I wanted to be a facilitator of that. I've also had a deep desire from a very young age to contribute positively to my community, to help build community, to sustain people and help them reclaim and nurture and rejoice in their own creative gifts and skills. I don't think there's anybody alive that has no creative gift or skill. I mean, this is how we respond to our lives, by problem solving, by coming up with something new, by being resourceful and resilient. These are all creative acts. And the more we engage in those creative acts, the more they spread amongst the people that we share our lives with. So wherever this comes from, I don't think it's unique to me. I think we all have these magical parts of ourselves that just need to be brought to the fore, and we've got to learn to trust them, because there have been a lot of voices in our lives often that have taught us not to trust ourselves, and so we have to kind of burrow down underneath that negative self-talk to get to the power that is in our language and our other gifts. Now, in my writing, I've written in multiple genres, but I'm probably best known for co-editing two anthologies of mindfulness poetry. Now, let me just stop and unpack that a little bit. An anthology is a collection of poetry by a variety of authors, okay, or in this case, poets. And so I had the privilege of working with my co-editor to identify which poems by which poets we wanted to include in this collection. So it's like the poets had done all the cooking, but we got to decide which of the dishes actually going to be on the table for you who sit down to the table to eat. That's the way I like to think about it. And my work on these anthologies took me toward mindfulness poetry, which is a very healing form of poetry. It helps us thrive. So I think of mindfulness poetry as very accessible poetry that grounds us in the here and now, that helps us stay tuned in to the circumstances of our life right now, instead of being so caught up in the past or too concerned about the future. We can take those things into account, but this moment that we're in right now is the only moment that is truly ours. This is the moment that we're alive in, you know. So how can we engage with it more attentively? And when we bring our full attention to this moment, sort of by magic, there's a compassion that comes along with that. There's an empathy that can come along with that. And so poetry of a certain type can help us cultivate this way of being more fully in the present, and of bringing to bear our full capacity to be kind to one another. So it's another way of trying to live from our true spot, you know. And when we read poetry of this type, we have some benefits, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but we can also then be inspired to write from our true spot. And we don't have to be a college major in English in order to do that. Anybody can write a poem. Poetry is the language of the people, but somehow we've begun to associate it with, you know, elites. And I think we need to reclaim it for ourselves, because there is such power in it. There is such good medicine in it. In the work that I do, I find that my readers and the people in my online community and the people who attend my workshops tend to be female, age 40 and up. And they have an interest in living powerfully creative and inspired and compassionate lives. So I try to encourage them to dive into poetry, whether by reading it or by writing it or both. And as they engage with the power of poetry, they find themselves, many of them anyway, empowered in their own lives. Now, I know that many of us, when we were going through school, especially, got turned off to poetry. I mean, we're given this poem, right? And it's like, what the heck does this mean? Maybe it's even written in language that was used, 400, 500 years ago or further back. You want me to learn about rhyme schemes and metrical feet and figures of speech? Really? You want me to recite this in front of everybody by memory? Really? That sort of thing. And it just, for many of us, killed any regard for poetry that we might have had before it ever got started, really. My dad was like that. He hated his school day experience of poetry. And he was a big old rugged farmer. And he always told me, if you ever want me to read something you've written, don't write poetry. And that was the sure thing. I write a novel. Yeah, he'd read that. Write a nonfiction memoir or something else. He'd read that. But my poetry, he thought poetry was hard to understand and irrelevant to his life. And then one day when he was in his 80s, and I was living halfway across the continent from him, and he was confined to a wheelchair, he picked up my first anthology. And with his bad eyes and his arthritic hands, he sat there in his wheelchair and he read the entire book. And when he finished, he called me on the phone, which my father never did. And he said, "You're going to be proud of your old pop." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "I just read your poetry book and I loved it. Can you send me more poems? Can you send me poems about farming and working hard and living in the country, poems that relate to my life?" And I said, "Sure." So I started sending him a poem every day by email until he couldn't read emails anymore. This opened a conversation between us, a connection between us that I think we probably would never have enjoyed otherwise. In some ways, it helped us to heal a relationship that had always been a little bit difficult, Now, not every kind of poetry would have spoken to my dad. Not every kind of poetry speaks to me. Not every kind of poetry will speak to you. There are all kinds of poetries, just like there are all kinds of cuisines, So you have to experiment with your taste buds poetically. What I'm most interested in is poetry that is accessible to the general reader. Again, you don't have to have some college degree to get it. And I'm interested in poetry that is good medicine for our true spot. It helps us tune in to the living of our lives, especially the tough parts of living our lives, helping us not only to endure the tough stuff, but to thrive in the midst of it. There are actually studies that have been done about this, and so I want you to know that I'm not just spouting an opinion here, okay? They know that forms of poetry, reading it and writing it, can provide comfort. It can boost our moods during periods of stress and trauma and grief. It can help us better express ourselves and make sense of the world and our place in it, especially when it seems really chaotic. It can be therapeutic for people who are under treatment for various forms of illness, as well as for their caregivers. And a lot of women are in caregiving roles, whether it's in their families or whether it's in their professions. We are tremendously powerful caregivers, and poetry can be another tool that we use to care for ourselves and care for those we are giving care to. All right. We also know that working with poetry can alleviate symptoms of depression. It can improve emotional resilience. It can enhance quality of life. You find a lot of people who are, let's say, domestic violence workers and counselors, family members of dementia patients, frontline healthcare workers, coaches, personal coaches of one sort or another, engaging in different forms of poetry therapy. There are actually organizations devoted to poetry therapy, and there are books devoted to poetry therapy. I'm not well versed in all of that. I just have an instinctive sense that poetry is good for me, and I've seen that it's good for other people too. I'll tell you this. I think it was back in 2013. I had this little musical trio, and we were performing my own compositions. It was the first time that I had kind of put myself out there musically, which is hard for me to do because, believe it or not, I'm an introvert and I don't like the stage. But I felt empowered to do this, okay? And of course, song is another form of poetry, isn't it? So it was just another way of working on that. And then we were almost done making our first CD. And one of the members of the trio up and quit. It killed the CD project. It killed the trio. And this person had been a dear friend, and so that relationship was gone. Just all of this totally unforeseen. And I had thought this big door had opened for me to walk through into more music in my creative life. And suddenly it felt like all the doors had just slammed shut, one after another after another. It's like, God, what do I do? I was in the dumps. And in the middle of this, I began to read poetry. A friend of mine who knew my sensibilities began to send me mindfulness poems. He didn't call them that, but that's what I began to call them. And again, they were these poems that would ground me in the present, in gratitude for being alive, for what it feels like to engage meaningfully with what is instead of what was or what might be down the road. And I became obsessed. I read poetry all day long. I read thousands of poems, and I collected poems that really spoke to me until I had over 1,000 of them. And then I realized I felt better, and there had been this therapeutic effect. And this had happened over the course of a number of months. And I thought, well, gee, if it helped me to read all these poems, maybe it would help somebody else. And so I decided that I needed to create the first collection that became Poetry of Presence. But it didn't start here. It started online at a blog that I did called A Year of Being Here. And you can still go to that blog and you can see everything there. There's a poem a day with a companion piece of artwork. Same kind of mindfulness poems. You can access, I think it was turned into 3 years instead of just 1 year, 3 years of poems, ayearofbeinghere.com. And then eventually that collection served as the beginning for this print collection. So what I'm saying is, I know the power of poetry to help us thrive because I've been through it. I've been through it, and I have seen what poetry can do for other people. But you got to find a poet who speaks to you. You've got to find a poet who speaks to you. And that's one place where anthologies like these can be helpful. I don't want to turn this into a big advertisement, but what anthologies do is they collect a lot of different voices together. So you can kind of have this survey. Do any of these people really feel like they speak to me or not? Mm-hmm. And then if you find somebody, you can read more of their stuff, you know, and they might lead you to another poet. And you'll find that you get into a river of a certain kind of poetry that really relates to where you are in your life. And your taste will change over time, just like they do with music and food and other things in your life. So it's like a big playground, but you're getting good medicine from playing around on the playground. So I think it's really important to do that play and to let go of the ick that we might associate with poetry from the past. Don't let our relationship with poetry in the past define what it's going to be for the rest of our lives, because as my father's example showed you, there's always something out there waiting for you.
And I think your father's example is a good example of the healing power of poetry. So for a person who's never written a poem, or a person who never liked poetry, it was not something they enjoyed in elementary school, what's one little thing they can do, one small change they could make that might put them on the road to discovering a little bit more about themselves, or a little bit more about poetry and the power of poetry? What's one little thing they could do?
Oh, take a photograph that you love and observe it carefully. Put yourself back where you were when you took that photograph. Write down, without censoring yourself, everything that you can think of about what you sensed in that moment. And you can even make it up. You can imagine. What are you smelling? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? What is the other person, if there's another person or creature there, what are they experiencing? What brought you to this place? Where do you go afterwards? And you can just generate all of these words and phrases, and then just start playing with them, like stitching them together. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but you're starting to construct something that wasn't there before. Just right there on the page. Don't worry about whether you're doing it right or wrong. There's no right or wrong. Don't worry about whether you're doing it good or bad. There isn't. Just play. And I guarantee you, there's going to be something come out of that that shimmers at you. Some light. And wherever there's light, there's power. Wherever there's light, there's gratitude, there's hope, there's compassion, there's connection, all this stuff. We underestimate what shimmers when it comes out of us. We find ways of dismissing it. Don't do it for anybody else. Do it for you. It's already in there waiting. You just don't know it yet.
I like that taking a photograph and just starting there and writing about whatever you see, or however it makes you feel.
With a photograph, you can do it with anything that's sitting around you. Mm-hmm. You can do it with any place that you go. You know, everything is grist for the mill.
Sounds like a good place to start. So tell us a little bit more as we wrap up about how people can access your services.
Well, appreciate you asking that, Myrtle. And so the first thing that you can do is go to my website, which is phylliscoledai.com. And I know I've got a weird last name, but I know Myrtle's going to provide you with the information about the
Yes.
spelling.
Yeah.
And then I have an online community called the Raft, which you can find at phylliscoledai.substack.com, or you can just follow a link from my website and you'll also get there. Or you can just shoot me an email. I love to hear from people, and my email is phyllis@phylliscoledai.com.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. I feel like I've learned something in this 20-minute presentation about poetry that I did not know prior to listening to you talk about it. So hopefully our listeners have done the same. So we are appreciative of your sharing, and we wish you the best as you move forward with the Raft and your writing and your empowering people through your writing. Thank you so very much.
Hey, Myrtle, I'm very grateful for you.